Okay, let's talk about Standard 19 Substandard D. Describe war mobilization as indicated by rationing, wartime conversion, and the role of women in the war industries. War mobilization is moving the United States toward war. In other words, getting it prepared for war. War mobilization. Okay, and three things. It's defined here within this standard as three things: rationing, wartime conversion, and the role of women in war industries. So let's look at war mobilization as our focus, and then let's look at these elements: war mobilization, rationing, wartime conversion, and women in the war industries. Domestic impact of World War II and war mobilization are our themes. So let's look at war mobilization. Here in the standard, it gives us the definition. Three things are considered war mobilization events or happenings during World War II. FDR and Congress and the government create or push these three programs pretty much. Rationing is war mobilization, wartime conversion is war mobilization, and women working in the industries is a part of war mobilization. Under rationing is the conservation or the saving of the citizens at home domestically of scarce items that are needed in war by the soldiers. We're going to look at it closer in a minute. Wartime conversion, to convert, to change. We had to change from making domestic goods like, clothing, shoes, and cigarettes, and cars, and trucks, and, food items here to making war goods that were needed in war. And we're going to talk about wartime conversion in a few moments. Women working in the war industries, their role is going to change from being in the home, raising the children, taking care of home, and they're going to go to work in the factories and these defense industries that are making these airplanes and tanks and weapons and grenades and everything else while the men are off at war. So we're going to see their role change dramatically. And all three of these are part of war mobilization, moving the United States toward war in World War II. Let's look at rationing first, and let's look at one type of rationing. This was volunteered rationing, where workers would carpool instead of ride their individual cars, or they would ride bicycles to save gasoline and rubber, which were pretty much items that were scarce and needed by the soldiers over in Europe. Moving tanks around and vehicles and jeeps and everything required a lot of gas, and the tires wore out a lot because of the ground they had to cover. So it was extremely important for those things to be conserved. Those are going to be rationed. Gasoline and rubber will be rationed, but the volunteer part of it is the carpool, where people carpooled and rode bicycles. Out of necessity, but also to volunteer. People are also going to participate in nationwide scrap drives, whether it be scrap iron, tin cans, newspaper, rags, or even cooking grease. Anything that could be gotten up and recycled to be used in the war effort. These are voluntary things that were going on these drives to get the scrap iron and all, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. And it was part of rationing, but it's volunteer rationing. There was a different rationing, however, in that the United States government required its citizens to ration. It was the law. You had to ration. So another way Americans conserved on the home front was through mandatory. Notice the word mandatory. Government rationing system. In other words, it was required of them. They didn't volunteer at all. The government made them do it. A lot of them did it anyway, out of good faith. Under this system, each household received C-books or these coupon books that were used to buy scarce items like meat, sugar, and coffee. Gas rationing was also used to help save for gasoline and military use. And here's some of the C-books here. Here's these point systems were used to, you had to have so many points to buy sugar. And here's 37 points to buy sugar, 41 points to buy coffee. You had to have so many points before you can buy them. Office of Price Administration, what OPA was. And this is 1 blue point. Here's for, let's see, a spare tire or flour. And this come in a C-book from the government. They'd give you this and have these little coupons, these things in there, and you had to save these up and get certain points before you can buy scarce items. And here's a little pouch with these little rations were kept. And here's a little thing that I found that shows you how many points it requires. For you to buy a can of peas, 1 pound 4 ounces, 16 points required. Fruits like peaches, you needed 21 points for that amount there. And tomato juice here, 17 points. They had different points. You had to bring the points in. The points themselves would not buy the product. You had to have the points to have permission to buy it. You had to give the money and the points, coupons, or little plugs to buy the product together. You couldn't just give them the points and then get it for free. You had to pay for it. The points were just permission to pay for under the rationing system. And here's some more war ration books or coupons used here. Ration stamps. Okay. And this was a little thing showing you how do you shop with a ration book. It shows you how to get your points out of there, and then you have to give the points to the grocer, whoever's there, and then you have to give them the money for it. Here's some rationing posters of the time. And these are pretty interesting. Without rationing, this woman's walking off with that. There's none left. But with rationing, everybody gets some. Plus the soldiers get some too. Okay, so that was the purpose of rationing. Make sure everybody got some of the ration, and the soldiers had. So here's the rationing safeguards your share. Here's one here. We are saving you. You save food. Well-fed soldiers will win in the war. And here's a little image of the father. Here's the mother and the daughter here. Remember, we must feed daddy too. These are rationing posters, trying to get people to think and understand what we're trying to do. Where our men are fighting, our food is fighting. So to conserve food and ration that out. Yeah, patriotic as I can be, and ration points won't worry me. A lot of people, there were some people, not a lot, there were some people that got around these ration points illegally, but most people follow them to try to be patriotic. Here's a, you dish it up, we dish it out, the best fed soldier in the world. Here's a pledge from a mother saying she will use ration stamps. Okay. And victory gardens, these are going to be voluntary. People grew their own gardens to try to conserve on the food that was headed to. So your own victory garden counts more than ever. To send food to the soldiers, conserve there. Grow your own, can your own. And here's a picture of a family growing their own garden, victory garden. Uncle Sam says garden to cut food cost. Here's the U.S. Department of Agriculture from Washington, D.C. about growing your own garden, victory garden. Here's some kids here growing their own garden. Here's a picture, a cartoon here. You can make this kind of ammunition. In other words, conserve food, and we can beat the Nazis. And carpools were a little bit of both, voluntary and, you know, if you think about the gas and the rubber for tires was part of mandatory rationing, but a lot of these carpools were voluntary too. The government tried to persuade people to do this. I share my car to conserve gas, tires, and autos. Planes need gasoline, share your car. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. So it's kind of showing the importance of that. Hitler rides in the empty seat, double up. They do it, meaning the soldiers ride together, so can we. It's a way that we can share in their effort. And these scrap rubber drives were needed in like gas masks, and in the airplane, some of the rubber needed there, and the rafts needed to preserve people. And here's some kids here going out finding these scrap rubber and bringing it in to recycle it. Here's some here. Here's some here. Some pictures where cities were doing these drives. Scrap metal. Here's a poster here. Help put the lid on Hitler by saving your old paper, metal and paper. Get into scrap. Right here. Alright, so let's look at wartime conversion. Let's move away from rationing and all that. Look at wartime conversion, because this is describe war mobilization as indicated by rationing. We did that. Wartime conversion, convert, to change. Okay, so wartime conversion was to change from domestic goods to wartime goods. And let's see what this means. Here's an example. Singer Sewing Machine Company, when the war was not happening in the United States, was making these sewing machines for women to sew fabrics at home. But with wartime conversion, the War Progress Administration and all that FDR set up is going to convert from making these domestic products to making war items. This is a M1 carbine rifle that is actually made by Singer Sewing Machine Company. So the Singer Sewing Machine Company is going to slow down to a halt these, or completely stop, and then start making one of these M1 carbines for the war effort for soldiers. So this is an example of wartime conversion. Let's listen to the President's address in his Arsenal of Democracy. He talks about wartime conversion. He doesn't say wartime conversion, but he explains what it is. Let's listen to what he has to say.
American industrial genius, unmatched throughout all the world in the solution of production problems, has been called upon to bring its resources and its talents into action. Manufacturers of watches, of farm implements, of linotypes and cash registers, and automobiles and sewing machines and lawn mowers and locomotives are now making fuses and bomb packing crates and telescope mounts and shells and pistols and tanks.
So all these things up here, from watches all the way down to locomotives, all those are domestic products. And all the industries that were making those are now making all these things, war goods, tanks, pistols, shields, fuses. And the President just said it out of his own mouth. He didn't say wartime conversion, but that's what he's talking about here in his Arsenal of Democracy speech. Let's look at this one here.
I am confident that if and when production of consumer or luxury goods in certain industries requires the use of machines and raw materials that are essential for defense purposes, then such production must yield and will gladly yield to our primary and compelling purpose.
Alright, so he's talking about switching from, or changing from, or converting from our industries making these domestic goods to making war goods. And here's a little image that just shows you Singer's role in wartime conversion. Here Chevrolet Corporation made these little tanks here and trucks for the Army, and these guns here and airplanes here, and some cartridges and bullets. And yeah, well, you see all this conversion from Chevrolet making normal cars. Here's Ford Motor Company, went from making a domestic type of vehicle for Ford to making like a Jeep. That's a wartime conversion. And here's another one for Ford. Used to make these domestic vehicles. Now during the war it converted over to making things like the B-24 Liberator bomber here. Had over 1.5 million parts to it. Where a domestic vehicle only had 15,000 parts, the B-24 Liberator had 1.5 million parts to it. And Ford started making these bombers for the United States at record speeds, by the way. Chrysler used to make these cars, but it converted over, wartime conversion, over to these airplane fuselages, the body of the airplane here. Okay. And so defense spending during World War II, excuse me, from 1939 was $2 billion, and then by 1945, the end of war, rate rises up all the way to $83 billion by the end of World War II. All right, let's change from wartime ration. We talked about ration. We talked about wartime conversion just then. The role of women in war industries. Okay, let's talk about that real quick. Women went from the home into these factories. And here's a fuselage of the plane, and you see this woman here putting rivets inside of this plane right here. Here's a woman down here welding something, and here's some making pistons for these airplanes. There's a woman drilling here, some woman filing something down. These women are at the industries working. They're not at home cooking. They're in these war production industries making these things needed for war. And here's a woman on a lathe machine. She's in there, and see her little bandana on her head, and all these women up here with bandana on their heads when they sweat, they can catch it in there. And there's an image going to come about from these women. Here's the front of an airplane. It's this woman working on this, all these coils and stuff in here. She's in a war industry making airplanes. Here's another one. This wheel here putting it on this airplane. Look at all those rivets back there. See those rivets in that plane to keep that metal together? Those are called rivets. And here's a woman here placing with a rivet gun. That's a rivet gun. These are rivets, these little metal things to keep this metal together on these planes. Here's a woman with all these bombs here to be dropped from the planes to attack the enemy. These women, and there's a bandana on here, these women are working in the war industries, and they left home, and their role is going to change. Now they're at work. Okay? And here's an African-American woman, Bertha Stallworth, and she's inspecting a 44 millimeter artillery cartridge at the Frankfurt Arsenal during World War II. So all these ladies are in these war industries working instead of at home with the children. And this image here is called Rosie the Riveter, and it indicates that women left home and changed their role from being at home with the kids to entering the industries. And she looks tough here with her little bandana, but this is Rosie the Riveter. We can do it. And all this movement of women into the workforce, into this industry, was a part of the government's war mobilization. So women into war industries is part of war mobilization as well. And so with these pictures of Rosie the Riveter and women in the war industries and wartime conversion, and then all this rationing going on, whether it be voluntary or whether it be mandatory by the government. And some of these coupons and these C books are mandatory government rationing. And we see all these. We've met our war mobilization standard at rationing and wartime conversion and women working in the war industry is all part of war mobilization. And that was our standard 19D. Describe war mobilization as indicated by rationing, wartime conversion, and the role of women in war industries. Ask questions in class. Good luck on the quiz, test, and the EOCT.